The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the vast expanse of untouched land. The gentle rustling of the leaves in the trees, the distant calls of birds settling down for the night, and the soft crackle of a campfire were all that broke the peaceful silence. In the middle of this serene wilderness stood a small cabin, nestled quietly against the backdrop of the thick forest. It was a haven for its lone occupant, a man named Jack, who had found solace in the isolation that only nature could offer. Jack was a man of few words. The world outside his cabin had always seemed too fast, too loud. He had lived in cities, tried to make a life for himself in bustling places, but something was always missing. After a painful loss, Jack retreated into the wilderness, hoping it would heal the broken parts of him. His cabin became his sanctuary, a place where the quiet spoke louder than any voice. He spent his days tending to the small garden behind the house, chopping wood for the winter, and reading by the fire when the nights grew cold. The world around him had faded into the background, and though he wasn't sure if he was truly at peace, there was a sense of calm in the repetition of daily life. His thoughts were mostly his own now, a welcome relief from the constant noise and demands of the world he had left behind. There was no one to impress here, no expectations. Just the trees, the animals, and the occasional visitor. A neighbor who lived miles away or a lone hiker passing through. That evening, as the orange light of dusk began to stretch across the sky, Jack was sitting outside his cabin, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, staring into the distance. The warmth of the drink seeped into his hands, and he inhaled deeply, the cool mountain air filling his lungs. He had a quiet moment of gratitude. For the first time in what felt like a long while, he was content with the solitude. But then, something unusual caught his attention. A rustling in the bushes near the edge of the property. Jack's instincts kicked in. His hand instinctively gripped the handle of the knife at his belt. He stood up slowly, scanning the tree line, expecting perhaps a deer or another animal to appear. But as the rustling continued, he felt a sense of unease. This wasn't the normal sound of an animal moving through the underbrush. It was heavier, more deliberate. As Jack stepped cautiously toward the noise, his boots crunching against the dry leaves beneath him, a shadow emerged from the bushes. At first, he thought it was a large deer, a buck perhaps, but as it drew closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was a bear. The bear was struggling, moving with obvious difficulty, its body shaking with every step. Blood stained its fur, the deep red stark against the dark brown of its coat. The bear's eyes, usually wild and alert, were clouded with exhaustion. It looked up at Jack, its gaze not that of a creature on the attack, but of one in desperate need. Its breath came in shallow, labored gasps as it stumbled forward, collapsing suddenly onto the ground just feet away from Jack's doorstep. For a long moment, Jack stood frozen, unsure of what to do. His heart raced, but his instincts told him not to retreat, to stay. He took a slow, cautious step forward. The bear didn't move. It was still alive, barely, but it was clear that it was in pain. Jack's gaze shifted from the injured animal to the small cabin behind him. The bear was right at his doorstep, and he felt the weight of the decision that loomed ahead. He had no experience with wildlife in this condition. He wasn't a vet, wasn't a hunter, just a man who had chosen a life of solitude. But Jack wasn't the kind of person to turn his back on suffering, not even from an animal. Swallowing his hesitation, he slowly knelt beside the bear. His hand trembled as he reached out, gently placing it on the bear's head, a tentative touch as if to assure the animal that he meant no harm. The bear let out a low growl, its eyes narrowing in pain, but it didn't lunge or move away. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he began assessing the damage. The bear's side was torn open, the wound deep and ragged, likely caused by a trap or another animal. The blood was still flowing, though more slowly now. "Easy, easy," Jack muttered under his breath, more to himself than the bear, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm gonna help you, okay?" But as he looked around, Jack realized that he didn't have what he needed. He had no medical supplies, no way to treat this kind of injury. He needed to think quickly. His eyes darted around the property, his mind racing. He could get a car and drive to the nearest town, but that would take time. Precious time the bear didn't have. A fleeting thought crossed his mind. He could leave the bear there, let nature take its course. But that wasn't who Jack was. Not anymore. He had chosen a life that was more than just survival. He had chosen to be a part of the world around him, not apart from it. With a deep breath, Jack stood up, making a quick decision. He would do what he could, even if it meant risking his own safety. His first instinct was to get the bear inside the cabin. It was sheltered, warm, and would give him the space he needed to think. But the bear wasn't moving, its body still trembling in pain, unable to lift itself. He would have to carry it. Jack had no illusions about the danger involved. He knew the bear could be unpredictable, even in its weakened state. But he also knew that if he didn't help, it would die here, alone, in the cold. Gathering all his strength, Jack moved behind the bear, positioning himself carefully to avoid startling it. Slowly, he reached down, gripped the bear around its large body, and with a grunt of effort, lifted it up. The animal's weight was staggering, and Jack could feel his arms shaking as he maneuvered it toward the door of the cabin. Once inside, he gently lowered the bear onto the floor, stepping back quickly, watching it warily. It lay there, its eyes still open, looking at him with something akin to trust. But Jack knew that the real test was just beginning. He had to act fast, he had to save this animal. And yet, as he knelt beside it, the weight of what he had just done hit him like a tidal wave. What if he couldn't help? What if this was a futile attempt, and the bear would die despite everything he did? Jack closed his eyes briefly, taking a deep breath. There was no going back now. He had to try for the bear's sake, and for his own. Jack stood back for a moment, looking at the bear as it lay on the floor, still and unmoving except for the faint rise and fall of its chest. The small cabin suddenly felt far too small, too suffocating. Jack's hands were trembling, his palms slick with sweat, as he searched his mind for anything that could help the animal in front of him. He had no tools, no medical knowledge, just his hands, his will, and the faintest hope that he could somehow make a difference. The bear's eyes were filled with something Jack couldn't quite place. A deep, painful vulnerability that made his heart ache. It wasn't the fierce, untamable gaze he had expected from such a creature. This was an animal broken and in need of help. Jack swallowed hard, taking in the situation in front of him. "All right," he muttered to himself, trying to steady his thoughts. "Think. What would someone do?" He scanned the cabin. There was a first aid kit, but it was nothing more than bandages and antiseptic. It wasn't much for a wound of this magnitude. He could clean the wound, stop the bleeding, but it would never be enough on its own. He needed more. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was getting late, and the night would soon fall over the woods. The nearest town was a few hours away, too far for him to make it back in time to save the bear. And even if he did make it, would there be someone capable of treating an animal like this? Jack's mind raced as he paced the floor, the bear's labored breathing filling the silence. Then, in a moment of desperation, his thoughts turned to the only option that made sense. The only option he could manage. He would do it himself. Taking a deep breath, Jack began by cleaning the wound with a damp cloth, carefully wiping away the dirt and blood. The bear let out a low growl as Jack moved closer, but there was no sign of aggression, only discomfort. Jack moved slowly, as if trying to coax the animal into trusting him. He worked as quickly as he could, knowing time was running out. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't afford to panic. As he applied pressure to the wound, the bear winced but did not fight him. The scene before him was almost surreal. A man, a wild animal, both caught in a delicate dance of life and survival. Jack had never imagined he would be in this position, never thought he would be here, trying to save the life of a creature that should have been beyond his reach. He moved to the next step, wrapping a piece of cloth around the bear's side to stop the bleeding. His hands worked quickly, his breath steady as he focused on each movement. The bear's eyes followed him, calm but still filled with pain. Jack could see it in the way it shifted ever so slightly, the small groans escaping its throat. It was trying to adjust to his touch, to the care he was offering, but it wasn't easy. Trust was hard to come by, especially from an animal like this. Jack finished the makeshift bandaging and sat back on his heels, his breath heavy. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, taking a moment to process what he had done. The bear was still alive, still breathing. That was the only good sign he had, and for now it was enough. His mind raced again. What next? He needed warmth, food, something to keep the bear stable through the night. But he had no experience with animals like this, no knowledge of what to do when faced with such a raw, primal need. His gaze landed on the wood stove in the corner of the room. It was small but effective, used for keeping the cabin warm in the winter months. Without thinking, Jack stood up and went to it, feeding a few logs into the fire. The warmth spread through the room quickly, a comforting presence in the otherwise cold, dark cabin. He turned back to the bear. Its body was still trembling from the shock, its eyes heavy with exhaustion. Jack could see it was slipping in and out of consciousness, but at least it was alive. For now, that was enough. "Stay with me," Jack whispered, more to himself than to the bear. "I'm not going to let you die out here." The night fell deeper, and the warmth from the stove made the room feel slightly more like home. Jack sat near the bear, his hands resting on his knees as he kept watch. There was nothing else to do, nothing more he could give. He had done what he could, and now it was up to the bear to decide if it would fight through the pain, if it would survive. The hours passed slowly, the only sounds in the room being the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the bear's movements. Jack didn't sleep. He couldn't. His mind kept running through every scenario, every possible outcome. What if the bear didn't survive? What if his efforts were in vain? But as the night wore on, he began to notice something. The bear's breathing was steadier, its body less rigid. It was still in pain, but it was alive. There was hope, a flicker of life that Jack clung to with everything he had. Around midnight, when the fire had started to die down and the cabin was growing colder again, Jack heard it. A low growl, not of fear, but of frustration. He jumped to his feet, startled, but the bear didn't lunge. Instead, it lifted its head, its eyes now focused and alert. The groan it gave sounded more like an invitation, a plea for help. Jack knelt beside the bear once more, meeting its gaze. "Hey, you're awake," he said softly. "You're going to be all right." The bear let out another low growl, but it wasn't menacing. Jack could see the gratitude in its eyes, the faint recognition that it had been saved from the brink of death. He stayed beside the bear for hours, watching it rest, occasionally glancing at the fire that was slowly dying. The warmth in the cabin kept both of them comfortable, the quiet companionship between man and animal growing as the night deepened. By morning, the bear's condition had improved. It was still weak, still in pain, but it was a far cry from the ragged creature that had stumbled onto Jack's doorstep the night before. There was something almost human in the way it watched him, as if acknowledging Jack's effort to save it. Jack stood up, his muscles sore from the night spent sitting, but there was a new sense of peace in him. He had made it through the night. The bear had made it through the night. And in this small cabin in the wilderness, they had survived together. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, Jack stood by the window, watching the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had done something that mattered, something real. He had saved a life that had no reason to trust him, no reason to care. And yet, it did. The bear's eyes met his one last time, and in that gaze, Jack saw something that took him by surprise. A deep, unspoken connection. A shared understanding. It wasn't just the bear's survival that had changed him. It was the act of caring, of doing what needed to be done despite the odds. In that moment, Jack realized that he wasn't as alone as he thought. He smiled, the first real smile in what felt like years. The bear, though still weak, lifted its head slightly, a soft grunt escaping its lips. It was ready to go. Jack knew it was time to let it leave. The bear had been saved, and now it could return to the wild. With a final glance, Jack opened the door, letting the bear step outside. It turned to look at him one last time, its gaze filled with gratitude, before it disappeared into the forest. Jack stood in the doorway for a long moment, his heart full. The cabin behind him was still silent, but it felt different now. More alive. He had made a difference. And for the first time in a long while, Jack knew that he hadn't just saved the bear. The bear had saved him too. As Jack closed the door, he felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. The bear was gone, back to the wild, where it belonged. Jack had saved it, but in some way he felt like the bear had saved him as well. For a long time, he had been living in isolation, holding on to the past, afraid to connect with anything or anyone. But tonight, something had shifted. He had reached out, not just to save a creature in need, but to remind himself that compassion, even when it's difficult, is the one thing that makes life worth living. He sat back down in his chair by the fire, the warmth from the stove still radiating through the cabin. He stared into the flames, his thoughts drifting to the events of the past night. The bear's initial suffering, the panic in its eyes, the hesitation that Jack felt in himself. All of it was etched in his mind. And yet, the bear had survived. It had fought through its own pain and found the strength to trust Jack, even if it didn't fully understand what was happening. Jack's gaze shifted to the window, the early morning light filtering through the trees. He knew he needed to get back to his usual routine. There were chores to be done, firewood to chop, the garden to tend to. But there was something different in the air today, something that felt like a fresh start. For the first time in what felt like years, Jack found himself wanting to face the day. He wasn't running away anymore. A knock on the door startled him out of his thoughts. It was a soft tap, hesitant. Jack stood up slowly, his instincts telling him it might be someone who had heard the commotion during the night, someone curious about what had happened. He hadn't expected anyone to be out here, especially after all the time he had spent alone. The forest was his retreat, far from the nearest neighbors, and even they didn't venture out this far often. With a quick glance at the door, Jack opened it cautiously, unsure of who would be standing on the other side. Standing there at the threshold was a man. His clothes were worn, his face rough from years of hard living. But there was something familiar in his eyes, something that made Jack pause. The man had a calm but urgent energy, as though he had come here with a purpose, but was unsure of how to approach it. "Can I help you?" Jack asked, his voice steady but filled with a quiet curiosity. The man looked at Jack for a moment before answering, his voice low but intense. "I heard a bear last night, a big one. Is it gone?" Jack blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected anyone to have heard the sounds of the bear's collapse, or the struggle that had followed. The forest was vast, and sound didn't travel easily. But this man's presence felt like a reminder of something Jack couldn't quite place. "It's gone," Jack replied simply, stepping aside so the man could enter. The man's eyes shifted, taking in the inside of the cabin as he stepped across the threshold. He paused for a moment, looking around as though searching for something that wasn't immediately visible. There was a long silence between them, the kind that only two strangers, each with their own unspoken thoughts, could share. "I figured you'd be the one to help it," the man said, breaking the silence at last. "You've got that look about you." Jack tilted his head slightly. "What look?" The man met his gaze, his eyes sharp and direct. "The kind of look that tells me you're the one who won't walk away from something that needs doing. That bear could have died right there, but I knew you wouldn't let it. You've got compassion in you, even if you're trying to hide it." Jack didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to such blunt honesty. He looked at the man, a stranger standing in his home, and wondered what he was really here for. "I'm not hiding anything," Jack said after a moment, his voice quiet. "I just did what anyone would do." The man chuckled softly, a dry laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Not everyone would. You're different, though, and I think that bear knows it." Jack felt a strange warmth spread through him. It was like the man's words had unlocked something he hadn't fully realized in himself. He had been so focused on what he had done for the bear, on the life he had saved, that he hadn't stopped to think about the way it had made him feel. For the first time in a long time, Jack didn't feel like he was just surviving. He felt like he was living. The man's gaze softened as he observed Jack's reaction. "You did a good thing," he said, his voice sincere. "But that bear's not the only one who needed saving." Jack stood there for a moment, unsure of how to process the man's words. He hadn't realized until now how much he had been hiding from the world, how much he had shut himself off from the possibility of feeling anything. The bear had been an unexpected catalyst, forcing him to confront not just his fears, but his own emotional walls. The man's eyes were still on him, a quiet understanding passing between them. "You might not know it yet," the man continued, "but helping that bear is just the beginning. The world's got a way of bringing people together when they least expect it." Jack looked down at his hands, still stained with the bear's blood, and let out a long sigh. "I didn't do it for anyone else. I did it because I had to." The man nodded, as though he understood. Sometimes that's all we need, a reason to act, even if it's just for one life, one moment. There was a long pause as the two men stood there, their silence speaking volumes. Finally, the man shifted his weight, ready to leave. "I'll be around," he said, his voice softer now. "Just wanted to make sure you knew. You've got something good in you. Don't hide it." With that, he turned and left, disappearing into the trees as quietly as he had come. Jack stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the man disappear into the distance. He felt a strange sense of connection, a bond with this stranger who had seen something in him that he hadn't yet seen in himself. He glanced back at the empty cabin and the space that had once felt so isolated, so hollow. Now it felt different, full, alive. The sun was fully up now, and the day stretched out before him, full of possibility. Jack wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. The world outside wasn't as far away as he had once believed. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let it back in. The days that followed were marked by a change Jack couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just the landscape around him, the familiar trees, the quiet stream that ran through the valley, but something within himself. The man's visit had been a turning point, a subtle reminder that his isolation had been a choice, one he could unmake. The air felt different, thicker, as though the world was pulling him back in, urging him to reconnect with what he had long been avoiding. As he moved through his daily routines, Jack found that he no longer felt the same detachment he had once enjoyed. The tasks that once seemed like mere distractions now held deeper meaning. The rhythm of chopping wood, the care he took with the garden, the steady flow of time, they were not just acts of survival anymore. They were acts of living. He thought often of the bear, the way it had looked at him through the dark hours of that first night, the way it had fought to stay alive despite the odds stacked against it. Jack hadn't just saved the animal. The experience had saved him in ways he couldn't explain. It had reminded him that there was more to life than just existing. There was feeling, there was empathy, there was connection. But still, Jack couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease that had settled in his chest. Every time he passed the spot where the bear had collapsed, his heart would quicken, remembering the weight of the animal's breath and the feeling of its fragile trust. He had done something for the bear, yes, but in return, the bear had done something for him, too. It was as if their bond had rewritten a part of his story, one that he had nearly forgotten. A week later, as Jack stood near the woodshed, stacking logs for the winter, he heard it again. The rustling sound he'd become so familiar with, only this time it was different. The sound wasn't coming from the bushes at the edge of his property, but from the shadows near the tree line. Jack froze, his instincts kicking in. His heart raced in his chest, unsure whether he was hearing things or if something else was out there, waiting. He slowly set the logs down, reaching for the axe, his hand wrapping around the handle with a sense of calm resolve. The last time he had heard that sound, it had meant the bear was in trouble. But it couldn't be the same bear. Could it? He hadn't seen it since that night, not even a glimpse. And yet, he felt a pull, an inexplicable connection to the sound. As the rustling grew louder, Jack's breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly toward the sound, trying to keep his movements steady. His mind raced with questions. Could it be another animal? Could it be? He stepped carefully into the clearing, moving closer to the trees. And there, In the dimming light of the evening, he saw it. His heart skipped a beat. The bear was back. But this time, it was different. The bear was standing tall, its body lean and strong. It was no longer the fragile creature Jack had rescued. It was powerful, its coat thick and shining under the fading light. The animal's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a profound silence between them. No growls, no noises, just the sound of the wind and the soft evening light catching on the bear's fur. The bear stepped forward, its movements cautious but deliberate. It wasn't the same injured creature. It had healed, it had grown stronger. Jack could see the scars of the past on its body, but they were no longer the signs of weakness. They were the marks of survival, of strength. Jack stood frozen, unsure of what to do. He hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated the bear's return. What did it want? Why had it come back to him after everything that had happened? The bear let out a low, rumbling growl, not of aggression, but of something more familiar, recognition. It was almost as if the bear was acknowledging something between them, something that Jack couldn't yet fully understand. Its gaze never wavered as it moved closer, its large paws pressing softly into the earth. "Why are you here?" Jack whispered, his voice hoarse with the weight of the question. But the bear didn't answer, not in the way Jack expected. Instead, it lowered its head, a sign of respect, before turning toward the forest. It paused, glancing back at Jack one last time before disappearing into the trees, blending with the shadows as if it had never been there at all. Jack stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the place where the bear had been just moments ago. His heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. Had the bear come back to thank him, or had it simply returned to its world, leaving behind the man who had once offered it a hand in its darkest hour? The answer wasn't clear, but Jack felt something shift inside him. The bear had left him a gift, not just the acknowledgement of their bond, but the reminder that he wasn't alone. Not really. The world had a way of bringing people together, even in the strangest, most unexpected of ways. And while Jack had tried to shut the world out, it had found its way back in. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack turned back toward the cabin. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life was no longer just his own. It had become intertwined with something bigger, something more profound. The bear had come to him at a time when he had needed to remember that life, no matter how small or insignificant, was worth saving. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly, and Jack sat by it, staring into the flames. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face it. He knew the world would keep spinning, that there would be more moments of connection, of heartache, of joy, and of struggle. And he was no longer afraid. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. He had helped the bear, yes, but the bear had helped him too. And as long as the world kept turning, he would never forget that. And then, as the fire flickered low and the night grew darker, Jack heard the sound again, the soft rustling in the trees. It was distant, but still there. He didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. He knew now that the world had a way of bringing everything full circle, of healing in ways that couldn't be predicted or understood. The bear had gone back to the forest. But Jack was no longer just a man living alone in the woods. He was part of something larger, and for the first time in years, he was ready to embrace it.